Okay, welcome to our brown bag discussion. Again, feel free to keep eating. I do want to introduce my fellow panelists here. We have Brian Hales, who's written extensively on polygamy and other things and fundamentalism and other areas. Mike Ash, who's written some awesome books out there that are like Shaken Faith Syndrome, and he's got a new one out there that if you haven't read, you really should. It's on Revelation. It's very good. Sarah Allen has been a contributor with FAIR with our discussion on the CES letter, and you're on part 67, is it, or 66, 67?
I finished all of it back in May.
Oh, okay, so it's just going up.
Yeah.
Okay, yes, that's good. And then, and he's also an active Reddit participant. And then we have Cassandra Hedelius, who's on our FAIR board, and is also has written on Mormon fundamentalism, but not the way we think of. So you write a lot. She writes a lot. Yeah, she's written quite a few things. So we thought we'd just have a discussion here, and so we're going to ignore the audience, and we're just going to talk among ourselves, and you guys can do whatever you want to do, but we're going to have fun. So, okay, so I thought what we'd do is just talk about questions that we get hit with a lot. And the first one I see over and over and over and over and over again is, did Joseph Smith send men away on missions so that he could marry their wives? Brian.
Gee, I've never heard that question before. Actually, it makes such a great soundbite that it keeps it's continuously regurgitated throughout the internet, and it originated with John C. Bennett in November of 1842. He published this as an accusation against Joseph Smith. And let me just make a plug for something that I have discovered as I've reviewed a lot of primary documents on the topic of plural marriage, and more recently on the origin of the Book of Mormon. But I believe that when we are troubled by any topic in church history or in the teachings, that if we can approach the primary documents with transparency, I'm making a plea for transparency. Don't learn about the church through secondary sources that may be skewing the data. But if we get into transparency, we will, I think, find a very wide berth, a very wide space for belief, a very wide space for faith to continue. And so I make that plea, and it applies to this question very easily, because if we study the 13 women who had legal husbands who were sealed to Joseph Smith, we discover that 9 of those men were not on missions. 3 of the three of the marriages we don't have a date for, so there's no way to know. Only 1 of the men was on a mission. It was Orson Hyde. He was an apostle. He was over dedicating Palestine. He'd been gone for over a year. I'm guessing that that's who John C. Bennett was thinking about when he made the accusation, but he made it plural, and there's no evidence to support anybody but Orson. But Orson came back, sustained Joseph. It's interesting, though, that Miranda Nancy Johnson Hyde, who is the woman in question, we actually have 2 sealing dates for her. One while her husband was on a mission, and one while he wasn't, and that one is actually in an affidavit she signed, which would usually be more authoritative. So this is a false accusation from John Bennett. I wish it would die out, but it's so easily repeated and so easily believed by people who don't seek transparency in the documentation that I'm afraid it probably will continue with us, but please don't be fooled.
Any other thoughts on that, or how about the general thing with polygamy or teen brides, or I know this is the hard ones right at the very beginning, but that's what we get, right? So how do we deal with things like that when we're talking to people? What should we say when those things come up?
They actually just posted one on our subreddit yesterday while we were in conference, asking how to explain polygamy to 14-year-old girls, considering Helen Mark Kimball. Yeah. The one thing that I normally point people to is Craig Foster's paper from The Interpreter from a while back, the assessing criticisms of early age Latter-day Saint marriages, something like that. Sorry if I butchered the title. But where he goes through and he talks about how back on the frontier, that was actually fairly common to marry, for adult men to marry younger girls. And I know Brian has a lot of research on that as well, about whether or not there was, that marriage was consummated and things like that. So there are a lot of different ways you can touch on that to get that across. Try and explain a little bit better what was actually going on.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
And so when I think about that, I think that for a lot of women today, it is hard to wrap your head around that. When I was 14, I was in middle school, I was playing volleyball and riding my bike. It's just so wildly different from how anyone would have thought about it in the past. And I mean, I'm 38 years old, I'm having kids, I have a graduate degree, I am worlds away different from the lifestyle of a woman on the American frontier in the early 1800s. But I like to read old books. I like to try and get into the worldview of someone from several hundred years ago. And I mean, to be a woman a couple hundred years ago, it was, like 60, 70, 80 hours a week of housework, to run a household, to pluck the chicken, to darn the socks, to wash the clothes and all of that. It was a lot of hard work. It was, watching children bearing children was super dangerous. And just there wasn't nearly as much of the mindset of, I can grow up and self-actualize into a woman with this full-fledged personality and my individualism. It was more of, well, how can I find a comfortable home, hopefully with a nice husband? I would like to have some children, and hopefully there's enough money to buy a sheep, to shear the wool, to spin the yarn, to darn the socks. And when you think about it that way, to me, or the book Pride and Prejudice, when Charlotte Lucas, she's a spinster, she hasn't been able to get married, and she, in the movie with Keira Knightley, it has her saying that, Lizzie, I have to marry this doofus guy because I need a home, I need protection, I need security. I'm scared. I'm a burden to my parents. They can't afford to feed me and keep me and clothe me anymore. That stinks. I'm really glad I never had to make that kind of a calculation, but it doesn't help to pretend that that never was the calculation for anyone who ever lived. And so reading through, again, going to primary documents, not just third, fourth, 20th hand, how they're reported on Reddit, these women saw things differently. They saw these opportunities differently. They were largely happy. A lot of the polygamous women among my own ancestors, they had it rough, but this was your life and you made the most of it and you found meaning in it.
So a more general question, if someone comes up to you and they're struggling with their faith because of something they've read on Reddit or wherever, what do you say? How do you approach them? Mike, you're the first one on this. So how would you approach that?
I think the most important thing that I always try to point out is that there are answers to these challenging questions. And just because that person is not familiar with the answers doesn't mean that there aren't answers. It's not a slam dunk automatically against the church. And that there are scholars, there are faithful members that have researched this, that have known about these things for a long time, and have come to a different interpretation than what critics would present the data as. And that's, I think, unfortunately, one of the things I see frequently is that many critics sometimes like to project that they are the objective ones, that we're just letting the facts speak for themselves, and it's just not true. There's a spin always on it, and there's different ways to understand this. And I have found, through my years, that there's every challenging issue that's out there, there's a way to understand that in the context of faith, of believing that Joseph Smith was a prophet, that the Book of Mormon is true, that God exists, and that I have never found the silver bullet that would destroy the testimony. There's always a way to understand this logically, and so that's the most important thing I think that people need to understand, and then provide some resources. And of course, that's what's wonderful about FAIR is we have this great category of resources.
But isn't it true that the main job of the church history department, there I'm shouting them out now, and the church library is to keep this information from the members? Isn't it all hidden?
So I might address that real quick. If my thoughts are on it, the challenging questions have been known for a long time by people that have studied it. When the church puts together the curriculum for lessons, it's to bring people to Christ. That's what it's all about. And there's a lot of fun things we could talk about, or interesting things from history, or even ancient history about how the Old Testament people lived or New Testament people lived and so forth. But those are kind of ancillary to what's important is bringing people to Christ. And so we don't have these things many times brought up in the lessons. And of course, if you're, go back 100 years, even 200 years, if you're learning to come into Christ, you may not know about some of these things yourself. Even if you become a church leader, you may be, I hate to use the word ignorant, but that's kind of what happens is we don't necessarily know about some of the things. And so all of a sudden it becomes hidden just because somebody, is unaware of it as they've gone through, different callings. But that doesn't mean that it hasn't been out there and available to anybody that's wanted to know.
And I was just thinking about, we heard from Jed Woodworth this morning about the Saints volumes, and I think one thing that everybody loves about them is that they are so open, so real, that people doubted, people made bad choices, and they still came through it. And as I'm pretty sure it's Terrell Givens, in one of his books, he put it that, there's going to be enough facts and evidence and indications that you can put all that together into a conclusion that you don't believe in the church and it's not true. There are also plenty of facts and evidence and conclusions that you can put it together into the conclusion that it is true. And that's one of the tests of mortality, to exercise our curiosity and our intellect and go find information, and then it comes down to, what do you value? What are you pursuing? What do you choose to believe?
Let me just respond on the topic of polygamy, because I've heard from a lot of people who said the church lied to me about Joseph Smith and polygamy. And this, of course, when the Gospel Topic essay came out in 2014, a lot of people were not aware. And I've done some research on that to try to figure out what happened. And I think that the chronology goes like this. 1904, President Joseph F. Smith stops authorizing any plural marriages. By the 1920s and 30s, there are still people, they're all excommunicated or outside of the church, but they want to practice polygamy. They're fundamentalist polygamists. And they start to unite together in the 20s. And by the 1930s and 40s, there's thousands of these people, and they're getting a lot of media attention. And it's really annoying to President Heber J. Grant at the time. And so he sets up a policy that is, we are a monogamous church. We are not them. We're not going to talk about polygamy. And on the history side, the historians are not going to be pursuing polygamy because we're a monogamous church now. And this goes on for decades. And then about the year 2000 or so, the internet shows up, and not everything on the internet is false. And so the church has to play a little bit of catch up, which means that we start to acknowledge that we did polygamy, but the policy had been in place for many decades. And if you know how the church works, the church leaders don't change policies really fast or very easily, but the church did change it very quickly, and that's why we have the Gospel Topic essay, which now allows us to talk freely about that topic. And it wasn't like they were trying to hide it. It wasn't like general authorities were given a portfolio that says, here's all the stuff we don't talk about, okay? All the secret information. That isn't it. In fact, Scott and I were in a meeting with some of the brethren with the big B, and one of them made the comment that, hey, we're learning about these details of these controversies with everybody else because they're involved with administration and with priesthood ordinances and things, that's where their focus is. And so the idea that the church lied to somebody is simply just not true. There have been policies that maybe could have been reversed a little earlier, but we're all moving together to be transparent today. It's just wonderful that the church is being totally transparent with their documentation, the things that are uploaded and digitized. It's amazing that they're not trying to hide, I think, anything, that even if it makes somebody look kind of bad, they still want the truth out there, and it's a blessing to us.
I think one of the big problems today also is people just read like the headlines and they don't read the actual articles. They'll maybe look at a couple of bullet points and then they'll just move on. So with the way that headlines are so twisted these days as well, it is really important that you have to do the work. You have to read the articles, you have to look at the footnotes, you have to go back to the primary documents as often as possible. You have to try and figure out what was really going on. And like President Nelson said recently, the Lord loves effort on his behalf. And that is part of what this entails. You have to put in that effort. But if you do, then you're going to find all the information that you need, and you're going to be able to process it in a way that makes sense to you. You're going to be able to go through it, and you're going to be able to find what you need and get the answers, because they are out there. They, like Mike was saying, they've just been out there for ages and ages and ages, and they're everywhere. You just have to know where to look for them, and you have to sit down and actually put in the work. And I know a lot of people don't like studying history, or they don't like studying the gospel, or, they think it's boring, but you have to put in that effort to do it.
So I'll tell you what response I've gotten to that. And I agree with 100% with you, but they say, you're gaslighting me and you're blaming the victim, because I'm a victim here. And I've been told that to my face. You're victim blaming.
So my response to that is, you might not necessarily should have known it, but you could have known it. Because I found all that stuff just reading library books before the internet was even really a thing. It was all out there. So if I could find it, so can you.
I know I'm one, starting with FAIR early on, just from the very beginning of my career, I would always read the footnotes. So because I ran into a lot of new stuff I hadn't seen before over the years, and I'd look at it and say, well, let me read the footnotes. And so I'd read the full article or the full whatever it is that came out from Gerald and Sandra Tanner or whatever. And it was, when you look at the full articles, 80-85% of the time it answered the question. Which made me wonder then, when I was watching someone's podcast, I won't mention whose, but I happened to just catch it, and he was really promoting Gerald and Sandra Tanner's books. And I was thinking, gosh, why, all you have to do is look at their sources where they get their information from, and you see how wildly misquoted or the original sources are. Okay, I'm going to ask a really philosophical question here. I know Tarek's not up here, but it's philosophy. Why do you think that, or first of all, do you think those on the various podcasts and YouTube videos and things, do you think they honestly believe these things, or do you think sometimes they know that there's alternate answers for it? And if they do know there's alternate answers, why do you think they promote it? Or, I know you don't know the answer, but just your speculation on this.
So I'll throw in my speculation. I have a tendency to try to think the best of people, and so I try to give people the benefit of the doubt. Every one of us, listening, sitting here, whatever, we all do things that offend people. We all do things wrong. We exaggerate. We withhold information, and it's just part of human nature. So I try to be a little bit easy and think, okay, this person, that's maybe part of the personality. I have seen, having said that, there are a number of instances where I know, having discussed with that person these issues, that they know for a fact that what they're saying now doesn't really hold water, that there's some powerful arguments to refute it, and they frame it in a way that they I can't see how they don't know that, especially since they've seen the answers before. So there are instances of that, and that's very unfortunate. And again, I don't want to, be too much of a judge on that person, because they don't know what's going on in their head, why they made that kind of decision, because like I said, we all make bad decisions. So I think overall, most critics probably, they don't accept the church for their personal reasons, and they can still be good people, and then that's fine. but I have seen some instances where it's, I think, blatant, because I've already discussed this with them and they know that there's answers when they claim that there isn't.
Do you remember that old classic, They Lie in Wait to Deceive, about Professor D.J. Nelson, the Egyptologist? There are cases, and this is an older book, you can probably find PDFs of it online.
Some on the auction table.
Yeah, there's someone, yes. Go bid on it over at the auction table. And this was decades ago. This guy, D.J. Nelson, I'm a professor of Egyptology, and the Book of Mormon or the Book of Abraham is false. And this book went into his background, found out, no, he's more like a promoter of mystical crystal science at a community college. There was nothing.
Hey there, I teach at a community college now. No, I'm teasing.
So there have been cases of critics who were proven to be total bunk and inflating their credentials, and there was a lot of that in the kind of old style evangelical anti-Mormon movement. And there are good reasons to think that some of today's prominent critics protest a bit too much when they say this is all intellectual, this is all about the facts, this is all about a totally rational reading of history and the facts and all of that, when in fact there's a lot more going on. And I pulled this up, I screenshotted it earlier, because I figured it would be relevant. A few months ago, President and Sister Nelson did the Fireside, the devotional for young adults, and said, now please hear me when I say, do not be led astray by those whose doubts may be fueled by things you cannot see in their lives. And I think that could be applicable both to critics who actually have other motives than pure, unadulterated rationality. None of us have that going for us all the time. And also that maybe their feelings against the church are informed by difficult things that happen to them, or some mental difficulties, or just family dynamics, just things that we don't know, and the quiet heart is hidden sorrows that the eye can't see. And I guess where that gets you when you're trying to process accusations or helps a loved one whose testimony is faltering, is that emotion definitely plays a role. Someone who is in the phase, someone I love right now is in the phase that, just look at the history, look at the facts, look at this Reddit thread, and it tells you there plain as day. You can't deny that this shows the church is a fraud and Joseph Smith was a charlatan. But what is underlying it is the search for a nice narrative that fits a hole that they're trying to fill, if that makes sense. A story to be able to latch onto that fills a need for them. So we can be sensitive to that. They might not be open to having their story challenged right now, but maybe try to find other ways to help them meet that need and fill that hole. Be loving, be open, and eventually, hopefully, there will be a way to be like, so here's a little more context. Here's a reason why your narrative is actually pretty not true.
Well, I almost wonder sometimes if they do the same things they accuse us of doing, rightfully accuse us of doing, where we've already made up our minds about it, so we then selectively accept the evidences that support our position and then reject the evidences that don't support our position. And we do that. I mean, I admit we do that.
Oh, sure.
Everybody does. But go ahead. Yes.
A few months ago, or maybe over a year ago, Larry Foster, he's a professor, non-Latter-day Saint, who writes on polygamy and has done some really good research, but he wrote an article where he referred to some books that I'd written and my conclusions, and he said basically that professional historians agree with him, amateur historians agree with Brian Hales. And I thought to myself, that really isn't it. There's lots of professional historians who do concur with most of my conclusions, but the thing that I have found in interpreting the data on plural marriage, and an excellent example is plurality of husbands. How many of you are wondering why Joseph was sealed to other men's wives? Legally married women were sealed to Joseph Smith. There's been a big controversy. And it was the one thing that drew me into studying this back in 2007, this question. And what I've discovered is there's no unambiguous evidence to support that Joseph Smith actually was a husband at the same time these women had legal husbands. No unambiguous evidence. No matter how many videos Dan Vogel makes, no matter how many articles are written, there's no unambiguous evidence. But what we find is that interpreting this ambiguous evidence is that if you already believe Joseph was a fraud, you will interpret it one way. If you believe he was a prophet, you will interpret it another way. In other words, the most important element, I think, at least with this data, in interpreting it is what your beliefs are, your a priori beliefs are as you're going into it.
Your worldview drives your analysis.
Sorry. That's what you were saying, though, right? And so it's very prominent to me that and on the topic of we call it polyandry, but it's such a confusing word. The plurality of husbands never happened. It would have been an explosive doctrine, and had Joseph even taught it, let alone practiced it, somebody would have complained, and nobody did. It's the elephant in the room of these people who say Joseph practiced it, but it's very evident as we look at the topic and the evidences that the critics will cite. And it took me a few years. Sorry, I'm being verbose here, but when I started to research that topic, I realized that every author that had published on Joseph Smith and plural marriage up to my books coming out 10 years ago had described Joseph Smith practicing polyandry. Yeah, he wanted to be a second husband to these women, and yeah, everybody went along with it, was the way they told the story. It took me a while to realize that every one of these authors either stated or portrayed Joseph as a fraud and an adulterer. And so the conclusion for me was, well, if you already believe Joseph is a fraud and an adulterer, the idea that he would just add polyandry, or a plurality of husbands, to his already teaching of plurality of wives, so he could expand his sexual opportunities, that didn't take a lot of convincing, because there was no unambiguous evidence. And once that I realized that, it's like, okay, let's go back to what the evidence is saying. And as I've mentioned, he didn't do it, he wouldn't have done it, it would have been adultery. And these people that are just too easily convinced because they already believe that's something that he would do because he was a fraud and an adulterer.
I think one other thing that drives our modern critics are clicks, because it's a revenue stream. You actually get paid per view. And so the more outlandish you can be, I think the expression for it, please forgive this term, is outrage porn. You want to get people outraged about something so that way they watch it, they share it with their friends. It's a great missionary tool. Maybe we ought to, try and do that.
Mormons are exotic and weird enough that they keep making TV shows about us because it sells.
Yeah, we're suddenly very popular on television. I liked there was a comic that said, why aren't there more television shows that include Mormons? Oh wait, stop. So it's interesting. Let's pivot slightly to one that Cassandra just mentioned in passing, Book of Abraham. Isn't the Book of Abraham really the nail in the coffin against the church about Joseph Smith being a prophet? No.
No, I love the Book of Abraham. I think it's fantastic. And there's a ton of different areas you can study on it, and there's a ton of different questions, but I have not found anything in years and years of study on it that in any way is distracting or weakening my testimony at all.
But according to the CES letter, there were 12 Egyptologists that said it was false. Of course, that was in 1920-something or something like that.
Yeah. Well, when he he was going through it in the CS letter and citing those Egyptologists. I think the youngest one was born around the time of the Civil War. So he goes on and on and on about what modern Egyptologists say and then doesn't quote any of them.
Also, I have to point out that, again, scholars, LDS scholars, I think there's basically two different approaches on the Book of Abraham for believing scholars, and Dr. John Gee has done some wonderful work on it, and Carrie Muhlstein and others pointed out that there's a lot of things that actually mesh very well with what we find from Joseph Smith, from not only the narrative, the Abrahamic narrative, but even sometimes with some of the iconography that's from the facsimiles. And so there's things that pretty hard to overlook that, Joe Smith guessed right on it. The other one, and it's interesting that on the Gospel Topics page, the LDS.org, it mentions, this one and the other one, what many people call the pure revelation theory. And, we know that Joseph Smith, I think most people know that they're here, that Joseph Smith didn't look at the characters of the plates to translate the Book of Mormon, that he used, Urim and Thummim, seer stone, to get the translation. And of course, he received the Book of Moses and the parchment of John and all these other things through revelation. And so it's very possible that the Abrahamic papyri also served somehow as a catalyst or in some way to get revelation of actual text that might have existed previously or teachings or something along those lines. And so there's some really good arguments for both of these. And again, that they're logical, they're scholarly, and they fit within a paradigm that still accepts belief. And as Cassandra and Brian already pointed out, that many times it's the worldview that drives us. It's the tail that wags the dog. And so there's, if depending on what you choose to believe, you're going to find ways to get these things to fit, either with belief or unbelief. And so really, belief comes down to choice ultimately, and it's where our heart is. And so if we want to, follow the spiritual path, we can find that there are very logical, rational, scholarly answers for all of these challenges.
Let me just add, as I've studied the origin of the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith generated over 400,000 words that he considered to be revelation. 270,000 were the Book of Mormon. And the Book of Abraham is about 5,200 words. So it's less than 1.5% of all of the revelatory words Joseph Smith generated. And the question, of course, is what's the relationship between this, I call it a revelation, and the papyri that he had? And I'm not going to explore that. The only way Joseph would have known of a relationship is if God had told him, because he didn't know the hieroglyphics, he didn't know what they meant. But the point I would make is that here we have less than 1.5% of all of his revelations, and people want to just reduce the question of Joseph as a prophet to this one little sliver of what he did as a prophet. And really, this reductionist mentality is inadequate if the explanation doesn't expand to tell us how did he generate the Book of Mormon or all of these other things that he did that are just as much a revelation as the Book of Abraham.
So I'm going to ask a very hard question here. We only have 5 minutes left, just so you know, in the last 5 minutes. Let's say your spouse, your child, grandchild, best friend, somebody came to you and said, I've been seeing things on the internet and I just don't think the church is true anymore. What would you say? How would you respond? Or what would you do?
Well, I mean, number one, I mean, with the greatest laws are, to love our fellow man of God, so we never give up, never surrender. I'd use from Galaxy Quest there, but I have people in my family that have no longer believe in the church, and I don't love them any less. And everybody has to find their own happiness, make their own peace. And I don't know what's going on in somebody else's head. Why is it that I see logical arguments, for belief, whereas they see logical arguments against belief? I can't get in their heads. I can't get in their hearts. And so I have to accept that that's the path that they're deciding makes them happiest. And I hope that they find the greatest happiness in that. wouldn't surrender my beliefs by, saying, yeah, that's, I think you've made the best choice. I think that the best choice is that, like I said, I see the arguments, and I would try to, provide options if they wanted to read those or watch those or find some sort of support. But it doesn't change, I don't think. Everything that we're involved in with the gospel and the premortal existence and the hereafter is about unity, and it's about becoming one with each other. And I think that's that's part of the mortal testing ground, and we're going to have these challenges, but definitely never give up that love and support for anybody.
I was going to say something similar. I think that, just showing each other love and respect, and if they do have questions that they want answered, do your best to help out, but otherwise, just keep loving them, keep praying for them, and just let them know that, that doesn't change anything.
This is an answer to a slightly different question, but my point of view right now is very colored by being the mother of small children. And Mike's the one who wrote this article years ago about inoculation. And there is a lot of value in being the first one to bring up the challenging questions when you're teaching kids, when you're a teacher at church or with youth. And you don't have to be afraid of it. Just do your homework and present it in a truthful but faithful context, and that can really go a long way to head off later problems.
My thought always is that life is eternal, and we too often mistakenly go back to life is just what we see here. And so what choices people make now, we may feel are unfortunate, but there's a lot of time for repentance. So on our part and on theirs. So I think that I think it, for me, it makes it easier to accept whatever decisions they make now by thinking, that's going to be their decision for now, but things may change at some point. Hey, I want to thank all of you for your time. Any last minute words, or are you good? So. One more thing.
It's from President Nelson again, that devotional. If family and friends should step away from the church, continue to love them. It is not for you to judge another's choice any more than you deserve to be criticized for staying faithful. So don't let it become a point of acrimony. Don't sit there and take it if they make accusations that you're a terrible person for continuing to believe in this terrible church, but also just, I love you. You are a grown-up and a rational being who can make this choice for yourself. Let's find a way forward to still be loving and have a good relationship.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.